Going to speak up for the option of leaving the customs union. I thought, in the interest of attempted balance, at least perhaps I should make a brief contribution. Can I say that I thought the noble Lord Wigley spoke with great passion, not to me entirely persuasively, but his sincerity was palpable. But some of the phrases he used, I think, do not really correspond with the reality of the situation as I see it. He talked about breaking our ties. It isn't the government's intention that we should break our economic ties with the single market. He talked about this being an absolutist solution. No one's pursuing something out of dogma. We're trying to make an assessment of what we think is in the best interests of the country. And I agree with the words that my noble friend, the Viscount Hailsham, used. What we ought to be considering is what is in the national interest. And noble peers opposite may find it difficult to believe, but that is actually what the government are trying to do. It is actually what people on this side of the House are trying to do, come to a set of arrangements, once this decision has been made, that will maximise the welfare and interests of the country. Now, one of the things that I felt with the noble Lord Wigley's speech was he wasn't comparing leaving the customs union with what the government are trying to achieve. The government are trying to achieve a free trade agreement with Europe. That is what you ought to compare the customs union with a free trade agreement. And in what respect would having a free trade agreement leave the country worse off than it is now? May I also say, the noble Lord was talking about a customs union, but he did not make clear that he must, because he said he's not disputing the decision to leave, he must have been talking about a customs union while being outside the EU. That's a very different thing from being inside the customs union as a member of the EU. That's putting yourself precisely in the position of Turkey, which is inside the customs union and suffers, as I shall try to demonstrate, all sorts of disadvantages.
I just wonder if I could kindly make a suggestion to the noble Lord. If he were to go to 100 Parliament and sit and read the assessment, he would indeed see the comparison between being in a customs union and in a free trade agreement. And if he might look at the Hansard again to talk about the damage to the economy that my noble friend Lord Newbury described, he would find a great deal of that detail which explains that the free trade agreement route still leaves an unbelievably damaged country in every region, especially in the northeast, and virtually in every single industry sector.
Calculations that say that. The noble lady, no doubt, when she comes to make her speech, will give arguments. I'm not just going to be persuaded by a piece of paper with a statistic. What matters? What matters? Oh, noble members jeer, but are they really going to say that a piece of paper just with a statistic somehow analyses the problem? What we are talking about, if you have a free trade agreement, I put it to the noble Baroness, if you have a free trade agreement, you have access to the market. What is the disadvantage? The disadvantage, and I'm going to come to this point, is that you have to trade against that the inconvenience of rules of origin. That is what it comes down to. Balancing the arguments, the advantages of free trade against the costs of rules of origin. Now, I would like just to make a little bit more progress, if I could. Nobody has said that there are any advantages in leaving the customs union. I'd just like to make a few points. First, obviously, is that the customs union that we are members of on certain goods, not all, has quite high tariffs. It has quite high tariffs on goods that particularly affect the poorer paid, particularly on food, particularly on clothing, particularly on footwear. That is not an inconsiderable factor. Then, despite what the noble Lord Davis said, being inside the customs union would make it impossible for us to sign free trade agreements with other countries. Now, he was poo-pooing that, and he thinks we won't be able to do that. But I would put it to him, if he looks at the record of quite small countries like Singapore, like Chile, Korea, medium-sized country, he will find those countries have signed free trade agreements. When you add up the GDP of the countries they have signed free trade agreements with, which are very much in excess of the added up GDP, may I just finish my point? Which are very much in excess of the added up GDP of the countries that the EU has signed free trade agreements with. That is to say, these small countries, precisely because they're negotiating on their own, not having to take into account the arguments of 27 other partners, have actually been very effective at signing free trade agreements. Switzerland, for example, has a free trade agreement with China that the noble Lord thinks will be impossible for us to have a free trade agreement with. Well, it's not a point of order, it's a point of information, I assume.
Of information to him. We already have a free trade agreement with South Korea as a result of our membership of the European Union. Our leaving the European Union would result in our losing our free trade agreement with South Korea.
The noble Lord misheard me. I misspoke or he misunderstood. I wasn't talking about having a free trade agreement with Korea. I was talking about the free trade agreements Korea has signed with other countries across the globe. My Lords, another point about a customs union, of course, that a customs union is not just a question of collecting tariffs. It's not just about tariffs. A lot of regulations go with them. There are a vast range of non-tariff controls on goods, obviously definitions that you have to have. We would not be able to divert from these at all if we remain members of the customs union. We wouldn't be able even to depart from them in our own domestic market, because if we did that, the goods that were allowed in and circulated in the other countries of the customs union would be in contravention of them. So, again, I think there are some advantages, I put it, that have to be put into the balance of the argument for leaving the customs union. One mystery about this amendment is that, of course, if you're in the customs union, there is the collection of the tariff revenue. The individual country is only allowed to retain 20% of the revenue. The rest of it goes to the EU. So we're outside the EU, are we? And we're paying 80% of the revenue on the external tariff to the EU? That doesn't seem to me to make a lot of sense. The other point I would make is that it is possible to be outside the customs union and have a free trade agreement with the EU. That is precisely what Norway does, it is what Iceland does, it is what little Liechtenstein does. But of course, to come to the noble Baroness's point, you have to offset against that, if it's regarded as a cost, the fact that you have rules of origin. But is that really going to be, people have pooh-poohed the technology arguments, is that really going to be such an insurmountable thing to do? Switzerland trades, it exports per capita 5 times as much to the EU as we does. It has to operate rules of origin on many, many sectors when it sells goods to the EU, but it doesn't seem to have had any inhibiting effect. Well, I'd just like to make a little bit more progress, because I've been speaking rather a long time. I don't see, but you know, this is one of the points that is for consideration, that the rules of origin. I know a lot of British industry are very worried about this, but I noticed what Mr. Azevedo, the Director General or Secretary General, is it, of the World Trade Organization, said in a newspaper interview he gave the other day. He pointed out that a large part of Britain's trade already, because we have a bigger percentage of trade with the rest of the world than some other European countries, has to observe these requirements of documentation and rules of origin. And he didn't see that there would be a big problem in switching the rest of our trade to a similar regime. So I also have I've met representatives of some of the companies that run ports in this country. Some of their ports operate on a WTO basis, some of them operate, obviously, on an EU basis. But when you talk to the management, I don't want to name them because they wouldn't want to be involved too much in political controversy. Very much what I was told was they did not see a huge difficulty in moving from one administrative system to another. But whether people agree with that or not, I put it to you, that is what the argument is all about. It's a trade-off between that and a free trade agreement with access to the market. And it seems to me it is not clear that the advantage is all one way.
I'm most grateful to my noble friend. Does my noble friend not agree with me? I think it was Lord Davis who said that if you look at animal hygiene and the high levels that the Secretary of State has insisted that our farmers are going to meet on leaving the European Union, how can we physically check the animals that are coming into this country when we leave the European Union if we have customs controls at UK borders? It cannot be done by technology.
Well, we have, even in Northern Ireland, we have some checks already. I think there will have to be checks, as there are checks throughout the European Union. I would be in favour of there being checks, but I don't think this is an overwhelming argument against leaving a customs union. One final point, just on the customs union, referring to Lord Wigley's speech, when, as I said, what he seemed to be advocating was being outside the customs, being inside the customs union, but being outside the EU. I really do think, because that is the consequence of the amendment, that really does give you the worst of all worlds. I mean, if you consider the position of Turkey, Turkey has to agree to whatever free trade agreements the rest of the EU signs up to, has to have the goods from those circulating within its own economy, even if it's totally opposed to that, because it has no say in being able to negotiate the free trade agreements that are negotiated between... I'm allowed to finish a sentence without being interrupted. Without... where was I? Without the EU negotiates free trade agreements but does not take into account what Turkey wants, and Turkey has absolutely no say. I'll give way, and if I may say so, may I give way one last time, and then I want to make one other point about the single market, and then the House will be relieved to know I shall shut up.
Referred to Turkey twice, and he said in the first occasion he referred to Turkey, there are all kinds of disadvantages in its customs arrangements with the EU being in the customs union, but not being free to strike trade deals beyond that. Why does he think, therefore, that Turkey has willingly and freely stayed a member of the customs union?
Turkey, as the noble Lord knows very well, has had the aspiration, it may now be fading, but has had the aspiration of joining the European Union. So being in the customs union was for many of them a halfway house to joining the EU, just as for the noble peers who are putting this amendment forward tonight, this afternoon, it is a halfway house to rejoining the EU. That's what their amendment is really about. My Lords, lastly, just very, very briefly, on the single market, the noble Lord Newby was exhorting us all to go to the Treasury, look at the papers, draw the curtains and see the forecasts that are made. Of course, those documents should be taken into account. But I would also say there are many other studies made outside Whitehall that take a very different view. Could I refer him to the research which has been published by the think tank Civitas by the academic Michael Burridge, who was at the LSE, was at Harvard, who has done an in-depth analysis published on the Civitas website of the effect of the single market on the British economy and on British exports. And he's come to the conclusion that there is no correlation between the single market and the growth of trade between the UK and the EU. Furthermore, he has pointed out, which people have acknowledged in these sorts of debates before, that many non-members of the single market, countries outside the continent of Europe, have increased their exports to the single market much, much faster than Britain has increased its exports to the single market. So the idea that this great liberalising force has had a huge impact on the British economy, I think, is absolutely not proven. I make these points simply because I think this debate so far has been very unbalanced, and I think, as Viscount Hailsham said, what we ought to be considering in a sober, balanced way is what is actually in the interests of our own economy, now that this decision has irrevocably been made.
My Lords, I put... Lord, sit down. Well, could I just, on the customs union, he'll be aware, as a pro-European in his youth, that the customs union was one of the founding acts when the European communities were established. Now, I understand why Eurosceptics might have lots of arguments that they want to make against the European Union about how it's become much more federal, much more political than the economic basis on which it started. Why were the arguments that he made so powerfully in the early 70s in favour of membership of this customs union, why does it now prevent us staying in the customs union on leaving the European Union?
I'm sure the noble Lord is not intentionally misleading the House, but when he says the arguments I made so compellingly and eloquently in the 1970s, if he has been studying my maiden speech in the House of Commons, I shall be absolutely astonished. The reason I supported it in the 60s and supported the customs union, as he says, was because then we lived in a world of very high tariffs, and the EU was a liberalising influence in the 50s and 60s, and it was only after the American administration in the mid-60s started cutting tariffs that the relevance of the EU in tariff negotiations became much less significant. I mean, I think, if I may say so, since the noble peer wanted me to get to my feet again, may I say, I think my attitude towards the customs union is very different from his, but I remember a debate in which he spoke, in which he said, oh, by not being in the single market, the noble peer explained how he'd been to a German car manufacturer. I couldn't believe my ears. And the noble peer explained how the German car manufacturer explained to him how Germany was manipulating car standards in order to keep out goods from other countries. And the noble Lord thought that was admirable, and we were very stupid not to be part of this racket. Well, I don't want to be part of that racket.